Evolution involves more than the survival of the fittest. It's also about the survival of the most cooperative, and mutually beneficial relationships are critical to the survival of every species. Welcome to the Symbiotic podcast, where we will explore the collaborative side of life and work to consciously evolve science itself.
Hello, fellow Homo sapiens, and welcome to the pilot episode of Symbiotic. The purpose of this show is to explore and celebrate the increasingly important topic of transdisciplinary research. In future episodes, we'll be sharing fascinating stories about specific research projects, but today we're going to kick the whole thing off with a conversation about why that's worth doing. So joining me for this conversation are three outstanding scientists from three different fields here at Penn State. Andrew Reed is the Evan Pugh University Professor of Biology and Entomology here at Penn State, Eberly Professor of Biotechnology, and Director of the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences. Reed's research focuses on the ecology and evolutionary genetics of infectious disease, particularly pathogen evolution-related issues that may harm human health, such as antibiotic and vaccine resistance. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Cole.
Nina Jablonski is Evan Pugh University Professor of Anthropology at Penn State. She's also the director of Penn State's Center for Human Evolution and Diversity. Jablonski is known worldwide for her research into the evolution of skin color in humans. She is deeply engaged in public education about human evolution, human diversity, and racism, and is involved in the launch of a new genetics and genealogy curriculum to be featured on PBS's Finding Your Roots with Henry Louis Gates Jr. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you, Cole.
And finally, Cristina Rosa is Assistant Professor of Plant Pathology and Environmental Microbiology here at Penn State. Rosa studies the interaction of plant viruses with their plant hosts and insects that carry them. Her work touches on virus evolution, viral co-infections, the effect of climate change on viral-resistant breaking strains, and the use of nanotechnologies for virus detection and virus disease management. Welcome, Cristina.
Thanks, and happy to be here.
Thanks for being here. Yes, welcome everybody. So let's kick it off. Let's talk a little bit about, why is transdisciplinary research increasingly important today? Does anybody want to jump in with a first comment on why is this stuff important?
We're all looking at one another because we all know just how incredibly important this has become. And it's not something that sort of just happened. It's been brewing now for 30, maybe 40 years, but it's become more practical in the last decade. Science increasingly is porous. The boundaries of scientific disciplines are porous, and people are recognizing that they not only have to talk to their colleagues, they have to work with their colleagues in order to really answer the remaining fundamental questions, certainly in the life sciences. So transdisciplinary approaches are essential. They're not optional anymore. So it's a matter of figuring out how they're going to work.
Yeah, most of the really interesting problems in science lie at these interfaces between very different disciplines. So, for instance, chemistry of life is important, but in order to understand the molecular interactions inside a cell, you need to understand how the cell is working in the broader context of the cell within the tissues, and then indeed how the whole organism is interacting with the social sphere around it. So there isn't any sort of simple one-size-fits-all answer now. Those have already been plucked, at least in the life sciences. And now we're in an era where we're trying to tackle bigger problems, different problems, and that requires a much broader perspective.
Yes. Cristina, what are your thoughts on this?
I completely agree. The science I study is based on many disciplines. I work on entomology, plant pathology, plant sciences, and I cannot address any of these questions without working with my colleagues and without facing each other every day.
I often think about how our world's becoming more and more interconnected on a global scale with all these new technologies that have emerged, these disruptive technologies with the internet, et cetera. And we're starting to become more aware, in my view, that we have these common, really big, complex problems. Do you think that this interconnected world's making us need more disciplines? Are we seeing problems that we couldn't even see before, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. We can see, because of the interconnectivity now, we can see things we couldn't see before, and you can see areas of expertise that you yourself can't specialize in, but they could bring things to your own discipline. So it's easier to see what's going on now. But the interconnectivity itself is bringing new problems. For example, in my area, infectious disease, just the travel process, the interaction of people across the globe between people and wildlife, that's changing as a result of technological advances in traffic and transport. And so the problems themselves are starting to become very transdisciplinary.
So in a sense, it's probably impossible to solve these highly complex interconnected problems without bringing the different disciplines to bear.
Without bringing the different disciplines and without bringing people from very different cultural perspectives together. This is the beauty and the challenge, because you not only have to bring different disciplinary vocabularies and methods together and try to harmonize them, but often you have to bring together people from very different cultural backgrounds. And so this great interconnectivity that we all have now is something to be reckoned with socially as we put together research teams. So this is an extremely exciting and important time, but we have to be very reflective about how we do the science.
Would you like an example?
Absolutely.
You just take an issue like measles. Measles vaccination, in the scheme of things, developing the vaccine is a relatively simple problem. I don't mean to diminish that, but relatively simple. Getting vaccine uptake, getting vaccines into difficult parts of the world to reach, getting people in many societies, including our own, to accept the vaccines. That's a difficult issue in supply chain science as well as social science. And some of the communication that is going on with the internet, the social media and so forth, means we have new and interesting challenges to do with the measles. Even though it's a fundamentally simple problem caused by one virus, we've got a solution to it. Actually implementing that, getting that, that's a difficult transdisciplinary problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. Yeah, we just look at the nightly news and you can see examples of that all around us for sure. So, Andrew, I thought about asking you this. I know you recently took over at the Huck, although you've been here for almost a dozen years directing the Center for Infectious Disease Dynamics, and now you're thrust into this new role. So you're really carrying that flag for transdisciplinary work, which is what the Huck's all about. So, what does business as usual approach to scientific research look like, and how does it fall short? Could you give us some examples of the negative side of why some things aren't as valuable to advance where we need to be?
Well, business as usual means the individual professor getting on and making sure their lab is functioning, getting their grants, tackling their problems. And so, oftentimes people collaborate, but it's usually around a problem which is of interest to the primary professor. And that usually means it's a problem that he or she can solve in a few years with the level of resourcing available within that lab. But many of the bigger problems we're interested in are much, much larger than that. And so I mentioned before the measles example. People are interested in measles and the measles elimination on the planet. That's a huge number of different disciplines needed to bring to bear to do that. And you can't tackle that from a single lab. No one individual can come up with a magic bullet that is going to transform that problem. So business as usual means not solving some of the bigger problems that we have. And I think that's true in many of the medical settings, but it's true of many of the fundamental issues in life too. It involves collaborations between mathematicians, chemists, physicists, social scientists, everything. I mean, it's business as usual is to not solve problems. You just take some of the big successes of the 20th century, for example, getting to the moon. That's a very, very transdisciplinary problem. There are people interested in rocket fuels, metals, Newtonian mechanics, right through to how do you train an astronaut? How do you get those groups of people to work together? Achievements like that don't come from a single lab.
Great point. Nina, I wanted to ask you in particular, as a social scientist and anthropologist, what gets left out of life sciences research when the social sciences are left out of the equation?
A lot, in short. But to be specific, there are many aspects of life science research that require immediate and direct collaboration from and with social scientists. Anytime you're talking about biology in the broadest sense, including medicine, that involves people or that is influenced by people, you need a social scientist or a few of them to help you figure out how people are responding to a situation, how they might contribute or exacerbate a situation. Basically, when humans are either victims of a disease or are implicated in some kind of ecological situation, you need social scientists to help you interpret from the inside what it's like to be a human. In this way, you can build your science without retrofitting it later to try to correct mistakes. You can build it from the beginning to be appropriate to the systems.
Right.
Also, you really need social scientists to build your team. A lot of people think that teams just come together naturally and everything is just wonderful and you're doing all this collaborative stuff and everybody's really happy with one another. No. People are people. People not only have disciplinary differences, they have personality differences. The science of team science is really important to successful transdisciplinary work. So even if you don't need a social scientist, in your field site or working on your project, you need one to help steer the social relationships, to finesse the psychology of team members so that people can work optimally together. And the last thing that social scientists are really important for is that they help us see what our natural or culturally determined sort of restrictions may be on the way that we see a phenomenon. Let's say if Cristina is trying to judge the color of plants or seedlings using an objective or a subjective scale, who is making that subjective judgment? It's a person in most cases. You need a social scientist to help guide what criteria the observer is going to use to record their observations. So social scientists, first of all, they're really fun to work with. They're really, well domesticated as a species. They're not these, sort of, unruly, bizarre types of folks. They're really handy and they want to be involved. And involving them in these three ways, I think, is incredibly important to the success of 21st century science.
Thank you.
Yeah, can I give you a couple of examples of that, just
Absolutely.
to take up on Nina's
Sure.
first point? I work on antibiotic resistance. This is the problem of the bugs, the diseases that harm us, becoming more resistant to drugs.
Right.
That's a microbiology problem in some sense, but actually maybe getting the behavior change, getting them used in a way, antibiotics used in a way which can mean we can stop or solve this problem, that might be 5 to 10% microbiology and 90% human behavior change.
Right.
And so to me, if we're not involving social sciences in that problem, how can we expect, and that's a good example where you can come up with solutions that aren't implementable. We now at the Huck have social scientists involved in that second point that Nina made, trying to figure out how teams should work together, how to do that. We're actively engaging social scientists in the process of trying to form good groups, and that seems obvious to me. And on Nina's third point about the social scientists themselves being social beasts, it's very interesting to me that some of the biggest and most successful cooperative scientific programs on campus are coming in the social science arena. Substance abuse, for example, or healthy aging. Those are areas where social scientists are themselves working together, bringing their complementary skills together in a way which is making way more than the sum of the parts. The idea of the sort of genius physicist working on his own or her own whiteboard in her own office, that's not going to work in most of these other areas.
Yeah, one would hope that if someone's in the social sciences, they'd practice good social skills as well, and would hope those could go together.
They're getting better.
And I feel like as scientists, we are not trained sometimes to understand these social problems and issues. I think it's extremely important to be aware of them, both in the classroom and also when we collaborate together. And how do we express our ideas and how do we communicate our results? Well, if we don't have social scientists helping us, usually it's pretty inefficient.
Good point. you're leading me into my next question, which is for you, Cristina. You mentioned being inefficient, right? And so another aspect of transdisciplinary projects and teams that comes to my mind is, could things be sped up, to your point of inefficiency, or things breaking down or slowing down? And we're going to get into this in part 2 of our conversation, where we look at how nature evolves life and see, can we evolve science in a similar way? And I'll be asking you more about your research and some models we can draw from nature itself. But as kind of a precursor to that, I just wanted to state, people are used to thinking about evolution as a very long, slow process. But viruses, we know, evolve incredibly fast. Andrew, you were just talking about resistance evolution and bugs versus drugs, and how quickly these viruses can evolve to resist different medicines that we come up with. So I'm wondering, do you think research programs can evolve faster if we act like viruses, or if we become more transdisciplinary? Have you had any experiences where the research more knowledge was gained quicker because you had more people in the room with different perspectives?
Yeah, I think you're touching on 2 questions that are really dear to me. One is, how can we use the knowledge about viruses to improve our research? And viruses are extremely streamlined. Their genetic material is really aimed at few things, but very essential, and especially plant viruses. And they can also multitask, and they can help each other. So I think the first thing I would say is, for me, viruses are an example in terms of how do we accomplish our research every day? What can we take out from our daily schedule that can simplify our problems and our processes? Can we go faster if we focus on something very important and we take away the distractions? On the other sense, you are touching about the evolution of viruses and how can we cooperate together. Viruses can be in the same organism and they have some time to coexist. In the bad cases, they will prevail on each other, but if the outcome is good, they will have benefits. So can we do the same in our research?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and in kind of part 2 of our conversation, we'll be digging into that a little deeper. I'm Cole Hans. This is the Symbiotic podcast from the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences at Penn State. We'll be back in just a moment.
At Penn State's Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences, we investigate life from every angle. We study life's forms at multiple scales, from nanoparticles to global biomes, and we confront life's challenges across the globe, from the farm to the city to the wild. Welcome to the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences, collaborative discovery brought to life.
All right, folks, let's get into part 2 of our conversation here. It's very exciting, very cool stuff. And next, I just want to take a look at this next question. So let's look at, what does nature tell us about collaboration as an evolutionary driver? And how can we use this knowledge to get better at transdisciplinary research? And before we jump into that, I just want to share one quote. This is by Lynn Margulis and her son Dorian Sagan. Lynn was married to Carl Sagan, one of those names everybody knows. Lynn is a revolutionary biologist who brought forth the idea of endosymbiosis in the 60s, which was a radical idea at the time and now is considered absolutely accepted within science. This idea that it is collaboration indeed that is equally key to competition in terms of driving the evolution of life itself. And I love this quote from a book she wrote with her son Dorian. Life did not take over the globe by combat, but by networking. Does anybody want to jump in on that?
One of the things that comes to mind is related to my research. And my research is focused on plant viruses and how these simple organisms can interact with each other. And one of the things that viruses are good at is at exploring different niches. And how do they do that is by creating small diversities. And so when a virus enters inside a cell, it can create a progeny that is slightly different and that may be very, very adapted to the next environment. And can we harbor this information in our research, and can we make our programs better by exploring different niches? I think today research is very focused on key questions that everybody's exploring, but we don't have so much basically an understanding of what the ideas of the outliers do for us. And really, outliers' ideas are the ones that have brought our science much forward in the last years. So can we accommodate these ideas that are a bit different and research programs that are not following the main source of funding, and maybe come up with this niche expertise that will be very useful in the future? And maybe we can do this through education. Can we educate our students in exploring different niches, and can we foster this multidisciplinary cultural space?
I hope we can. I think we need to. I think we're recognizing that here to a greater and greater degree, and for all the reasons we've been talking about today. So unless somebody else wants to just chime in on that, I could also just take us back, 1.5 billion years ago, when there were these little bacteria, little one-celled life forms on our planet. Life decided to create something that was basically a permeable membrane, right? With the evolution of eukaryotes, with a permeable membrane that would allow material in and out. That is precisely what led to multicellular life, which led to plants and animals and fungus. None of us would be here if it wasn't for that permeable membrane, which just kills me, because at the Huck Institutes where I work, I joke all the time about a permeable membrane. I never know who's in the Huck and who isn't, because people are in and out all the time in so many various ways. I can't tell who to put on the website or not. And it's frustrating as a communications person, but it's brilliant for the evolution of science, because that is precisely what we need. We need people to cross those boundaries and let people in and let people out and let people take what they need and move as they will. So does anybody want to talk about the permeable membrane a little bit?
I was just going to say, I'm sorry that you find the marketing of this problem. The problem is it's very hard to wrap life sciences up in one package and even have it hold still for very long, because it's moving and so fluid now. And so people's, the research directions, the collaborations, the knowledge is changing so fast, it's not so clear anymore where the boundaries are. And in fact, that's one of the reasons for the Huck Institutes, because traditional departments like chemistry and biology, anthropology, they don't make much sense from the intellectual perspective anymore. The connections are often bigger between departments than within them. Things are splitting, fusing, reforming, very, very rapidly changing. It's super exciting time to be a scientist, and a little bit challenging for the marketing folks and for the departmental administrators.
That's okay. We'll take the pain. We'll take one for the team.
And another aspect of this, of the evolutionary process that really pertains to our sort of social fabric in transdisciplinary science, is that nature has had to respond in contingent and emergent ways, because stuff happens, forms of life become extinct, others come up, and what you see is, to use a modern phrase, a constant series of pivot events where organisms do something different. They interrelate to one another differently. And that's what you see in a good, flexible, academic setting for science, is that people see, I need to collaborate more with Andrew or Cristina, or I need to work on something altogether different. Where can I get that expertise? People now know that they have to sort of themselves be organisms and take advantage of the crises to really grow their science and interrelate to others.
Right. You're tapping right into another idea I've had. We decided to name this podcast Symbiotic because that's what we're exploring, these symbiotic relationships. And when I was, researching different stories out there about symbiotic relationships, you see them in the microbiome, like in the gut, from the gut level all the way to the macro level. You see them with plants, you see them with animals, you see them with single-celled life, you see them with viruses. It's all over the place. at every scale. And I thought about that classic idea of symbiosis from when I was a kid watching the nature show of, like the rhinoceros and the bird on the back of the rhino, and the bird gets a meal and the rhino gets a skin treatment, right? And so as I've been thinking about scientists, do you think that scientists are like different species of animal in some ways? If you talk about maybe like the engineer and the biologist, they can be that different, can't they? Do you ever experience that in your work as an academic?
I'm feeling nervous about this. There's no question that different scientists occupy different niches, and they can move through niches in time and during their careers, and often quite fast, maybe even over a space of a week. But the complementarity that comes from the equivalent of the rhino and the bird on the back, that happens all the time. And so there are people, just because of the nature of the expertise required. Don't forget, it's not possible for any one person now to know everything. It's not just the techniques. There's a very high level of expertise required, for example, to do modern day genomic analysis.
Yeah.
So if somebody's an expert on genomics has spent a lot of time doing that, but therefore cannot do, let's say, behavioral phenotyping well. And somebody who's an expert on behavioral phenotyping hasn't had the chance to become a world-leading expert in genomics. So if those people want to tie, for example, autism to the genetics, and we know that autism is an extremely genetic issue, if you want to tie this together, you need to marry the behavioralist together with the cognitive psychologist together with the genomicist, and both have to be experts. And there you've got a situation where you've now got the rhino and the bird, although maybe the scale's not.
Yeah, and maybe they can arm wrestle over who's who, or whatever it is.
And it probably changes depending on the question and the time and the paper they're producing or the patients they're looking at or whatever.
But I think we also have very many commonalities as scientists, and the first one maybe is curiosity. I think this drives our need for interdisciplinary research. Is do we really want to ask a question and get the answer from different points of view?
That's a great point. Back to what Nina said about teams, people have to have a common vision or a common goal. I mean, even with this podcast, everybody in the room helping, all the tech people are not on, they're outside the cameras right now, are all lending their passion and their skills as well. So true in so many arenas. I wanted to ask Cristina about the coevolution of insects and vectors that carry diseases a little bit. Is that something that co-evolves? Because that's another idea that I think is pretty interesting, that as one branch of science can evolve in partnership with another, perhaps they start to co-evolve. One discovery, I know some of our labs at the Huck, we can have one little grant that affects the way we use an instrument can affect 5 different research tracks and 5 different disciplines at Penn State with that one thing that's co-evolving everything together. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. So the problem is how are viruses moving from one organism to another one. So very often they move through vectors or insects. And how are these viruses able to manipulate the host, in this case a plant, to attract the insect and be moved from one side to another one, from one organism to another one. So basically, this coevolution allowed the vectors, in this case insects, to sense that the plant is infected and to move toward that plant. And why is this insect doing it? Is because maybe the plant now tastes better or has more nutrition than a plant that is not infected. So in this case, viruses are really clever and they can manipulate different characteristics of their environment. But this evolution will not happen if basically the insects will not get something back. So when we look at this story, there is something that can be learned from it. I think it's very interesting to put people from different fields in the same rooms. We are going to start talking. We are going to start exchanging ideas. But what is the evolutionary process of how we bring these ideas forward? So we have to have the same goal probably, and then we have to have time to spend together and to evolve these ideas. I think this is one of probably the field of research that is not yet well studied. We know how to bring people together. We don't know yet how to maintain this relationship.
To maintain the relationship over time, because evolution does require some time, and it also requires engagement, close engagement over time, I imagine.
If you think all the relationships that don't work, those are going to fail. but how do we make a good relationship that they last for a long time?
That's a great question. Maybe that's a new branch of research. Researching the way that we can put these teams together and keep them together and keep them working effectively, perhaps.
People are doing this because there is the recognition that we must understand the human dynamics between and among members of a research team, and that, in a sense, these research enterprises are like big organisms. They have a life course of their own, and we can't wish them into permanence. They're going to have their own birth, maturity, and death. And it's important that we recognize this and that we sort of design our projects recognizing that things are going to fall apart, but then something new will form again, and that's okay.
That's a lot like evolution itself.
Yeah.
I think in the case of trying to manage the scientific process, we have to accept that a lot of this will not work. We have to be prepared to take risks, and we have to accept this so-called failure is the price of success. And it's many entrepreneurs, for example, they expect 10 ideas, 9 of them will fail. 1 might, if they're lucky, really go big. We have to learn to live with that, and that sort of risk-taking, large-scale risks would involve groups. That's not naturally a part of much of the scientific culture, where funders particularly want guaranteed success, and so you end up with sort of incremental success, small steps. These big steps that we'd like to be able to take, game-changing steps, they typically take a lot of failure, and the payoff can be enormous. And that's a bit like life, that symbiosis, especially the big ones, the forming of the eukaryotic cell, multicellular life itself, societies, those big steps that led to huge innovations and lots of change, they happen because the symbiosis worked, the cooperation worked.
Right.
Lots of productive stuff can come from competition too, but it's typically more incremental. The really big game changers come from the cooperation part.
Absolutely. Well, then, Andrew, maybe I could ask you, what do you see as the biggest hindrances to putting together impactful transdisciplinary research projects?
Oh, I think initially there's a lot of language problems. It takes quite a bit of time to trust that you can get things out of this communal good, and everybody's got to trust that and trust each other. That takes some time to build, especially when the disciplines are very, very different in what they consider to be good, or the reward system, or whatever. That takes a lot of time. It's relatively easy for me to collaborate with another microbiologist because we all agree what the metrics of success are. We all know the sorts of questions we find interesting.
Right.
When it's a very different sort of person, like, let's say, a communication scientist, working with somebody who's in health messaging, it's a very different, even who's going to be what on the authorship, what's taken as success, what is the right way to think about a theory. All of these things are very, very different. And you can overcome that, but it takes time, and it takes communication, and it takes the development of trust. So that's long-term investments. I think the other key thing is to make sure that the skills are complementary, so that no one person or one group is dominating the arrangement and getting the most out of it.
Right.
It's got to be good for everybody. It's got to be exciting for everybody, intellectually satisfying for everybody. So that no one group feels like they're serving the needs or the purpose of the other.
Yeah, I was trying to decide if I wanted to go into this territory in this pilot episode. When you look up symbiosis, it's not always mutually beneficial. There are parasitic relationships as well, where but one's just a host and the other one's
actually the same arrangement can move through from mutualism, where it's good for both parties, through to a parasitic, where it's good for one and not the other. The whole spectrum can happen even with the same players, depending on the environmental conditions and what's going on. It can be very, very easily moved to a parasitic stage, system, but it can also move back depending on the conditions and who's providing what. So I do think that's a very, we've got to accept that is going, and this part of the reason for the instability in the long run is why some things can die, because the way the science leads you starts to benefit more the one group than another, and that can easily lead to the end of it. That's okay. It's okay so long as it's all done with good intent. That's okay.
Right.
And if I can just put in a little practical note, one of the things that is an issue in putting together working transdisciplinary teams is that the best teams have junior and senior people. But often university administrations at various levels do not recognize the value of this work, especially for junior investigators, especially if it's a project that's slow to get off the ground. And so junior investigators can find themselves in a very invidious position of wanting to be part of a really exciting research team, but then drawing back and saying, no, I've got to show these very specific results and I've got to hit these particular milestones for my promotion and tenure dossier.
Right.
The university has to understand that it has to change its standards to reflect the way that science and knowledge is now put together.
Yeah, I agree. There are a lot of old school, in so many aspects of culture, so many old ways that really sort of are being outmoded, right? I think it was Buckminster Fuller, though, said something like, don't waste your time railing against the thing you hate. Build something new that makes it obsolete. So hopefully we can muster the resources to build a better model and prove it out there in the world. One thing I've noticed in some conversations I've had here is that sometimes the mission can drive. It's a lot easier to have an impactful mission that you want to accomplish some sort of change that isn't necessarily tied to a research paper. And you can actually go make a difference out there. It gets trickier when you go into that standard academic world of publishing in the big journal, et cetera. So
there really are scientific communities that do that. Astronomy is a really good example. They by necessity, they have to get together because there's only going to be one instrument of that size. So you can get 50 people on a paper. Now, that does happen in biology, but if you look at the 50 authored papers, there's typically a few that have led it to get the most out of it, and everybody else has put their bits in. In astronomy, everybody is getting chunks out of this telescope or out of this cube buried in the ice in the Antarctic. They all get their bits and they all get their papers. They all get so the community as a whole is benefiting because all of the elements get them. And we in life sciences need to try to work towards that. Not everybody, but in many settings, we need to be able to get towards that sort of model, large-scale problems. And of course, if you do want to look at a gravitational wave or the origin of the universe, that's a problem that gets a lot of people excited and interested. The mission, as you said, focuses minds on that. And then if you can package up the submissions in a way that everybody's getting their bits, then you can get magic.
Well, that leads me back to the context you said of whether things are mutually beneficial or whether they become parasitic. A lot of it's the way that everything is set up. And it reminds me of what Nina said earlier about not having to retrofit after the fact. Oh, no, we should have thought of this before. So it seems like having a lot of foresight, if we can develop more foresight into the importance of making sure that everybody involved gets something important, the same way that the co-evolving, viruses with the plants, everybody, there has to be something for everybody, some sort of benefit for everybody involved, or they just won't get involved, right? There won't be any impetus to do so.
And you asked about the hurdles. I would say that one of the hurdles to making this work is you need good leadership. So we can do better than evolution. Evolution is largely a random process of trying things, try things. We can have, and it has no foresight, whereas we can have foresight. We can build our teams deliberately and carefully and think about the mission and who's going to do what and build the complementary skill sets in a much more efficient way than evolution. But we need that leadership, people who are prepared to step up and do that or take that organizing role.
Right.
Which is going to benefit them in the long term, but perhaps not the short term.
Right. They have to have the long game. Yeah. I'm a student of conscious evolution. Actually, I've taken a couple courses in that, and one of the big taglines is evolution by choice, not by chance. Evolution. We're conscious beings. We can evolve. We can drive evolution. Right. We've mapped the genome. We actually can start tooling around with the evolution of life itself. That's how much power we've developed as human beings. So we better be conscious about how we're going to use that power. Right?
And sometimes we can see that what might be good in the short term isn't going to be good in the medium term, and evolution can't see that. But we can see that. And sometimes humans are capable of taking the medium to long-term view instead of just a short.
Some of us get it right.
Yes.
More of that, please. Yes. While we're still on this section of looking at nature in sort of a biomimicry kind of way, we talked earlier while we weren't rolling about human beings are getting pretty good at looking to nature and figuring out how do we build a better wing or a better fan, an engineer making a new material by looking at how biology of living organisms is structured, etc. We're getting pretty good at that. But now I think what we're trying to figure out now is how do we look at the evolutionary drive of nature and evolve our processes, not our materials, but our processes to mimic nature and gain from the wisdom of nature. And with that in mind, I want to geek out a little with a new phrase that I learned in my research phase of this podcast, talking to Cristina about her research. And I learned what a cloud of genetic variance is. And I wondered if, do you think we could design a research project the way that clouds of genetic variance work? What would that look like? And if you could define it for our listeners a little bit, it could be a teachable moment for us, and we could maybe dig into that a little bit.
So what's happened when a cell gets infected by a virus? So the virus replicates and makes progeny, and the progeny should be clonal, but it's not. So every individual is slightly different than the parent. And so this is what we call the genetic cloud or variant. And this is a very important characteristics of populations of viruses because basically they are tending to be similar to the best individual, very adapted to that environment. But then when these viruses, they have to move either from cell to cell or from one organism to another one, they have to be ready to adapt. So they have already innate in their population these differences that are going to make them more fit, maybe in a different situation. And maybe originally these different individuals, they were not really fit, so they would not have been surviving. But because they take advantage of the cooperation of their brothers and sisters, they can survive in the original status. And then when they move to a new one, they're going maybe to be the winners. So the new quasi-species or genetic cloud or variant in the new cell or the new individual maybe will be more similar to them. I think we as a society are almost like a quasi-species where each of us has a different, slightly different characteristic. And how do we maintain these differences is crucial, not only for science, but for society. How do we allow these different individuals to thrive in an environment that is maybe not perfect? And can we do that also in science when we have maybe students or colleagues that are exploring different questions than we are, and maybe they're not so successful, but the questions are very important, and so we have to have maybe a university ability to give them money and to give them support so they can explore these different questions. And then when the time comes, this question, if they're very important, they will be ready to go basically, and these people, they will hit the ground and running, and they will answer this question much better than everybody else in the room basically. So I think maybe students would be a good bridge between there would be our progeny, basically, what
intellectual progeny,
intellectual progeny, where they are slightly different than us, and maybe we can prepare them, and we can foster their differences, and making sure that they are learning from each other and from others here at university. Maybe we are not able to do that, to share knowledge and language, but maybe we can train our students to do that, and they will be better prepared for evolution basically.
They can evolve as people and as scientists.
Yeah. And evolution doesn't happen on us, but on our future, colleagues and our students. Those are part of the evolution, I think.
I like that a lot. Well, Andrew, I believe you shared a little something about this topic earlier that you learned recently. Perhaps it was at a workshop.
Yeah, there was a workshop here a couple of weeks ago, and results were presented about a type of virus, which apparently the plant virologists have known about for a while, but I didn't, called multipartite viruses. And these are viruses that exist not as one virus, that's one genome that's packaged up inside a particle, but instead separate segments of the genome, usually one gene, and each one is packaged up separately so it becomes its own little virion. And depending on the species, there might be 5 of these, so 5 genes, or 7, but they all exist as separate individuals in any spatial sense, packaged separately in different places in the plant, but they need each other. And so if you take one of the types away, then the whole thing collapses. So you have these groups of 5 or 7 entities moving together, making the infection in the plant work, each contributing their bit, talking to each other. They don't even need to be in the same cell. They talk to each other, presumably via products that the cell is producing or that the cell is passing on to another cell. So they're talking to each other, and they need to exist as this whole. Now, to me, it's kind of like, what do we call this thing? It's not an individual, because they're not actually ever together. They are not a single genome because they're not connected, but then in some sense they are a genome because each of the genes is required to make the thing work. What is the thing here? Well, the thing is some collective thing we call an infection. So it's a population that works, but it's driven by separate individuals, all of whom are necessary. Very odd. It's not, and they can be in different cells. So it's kind of like a whole different way of organizing life. It'd be like us having 20, 30,000 separate bits of us that all need to come together in some plant to recreate us. It's weird.
Fascinating. Yeah.
The Borg.
The Borg. Yeah. Basically, it's the Borg. That's what's going on.
Maybe we could call it symbiotica.
I'm Cole Hans. This is the Symbiotic podcast from Penn State's Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences. We'll be back in just a moment.
Are you a science writer enjoying our podcast? We think you might also enjoy Science Writers 2019. This is an annual conference co-sponsored by the National Association of Science Writers and the Council for Advancement of Science Writing. It's coming to Penn State this fall, from October 25th to the 29th. There will be workshops, lab and facility tours, networking opportunities, and plenty of fun things to do. The Symbiotic crew will be there too. We're hosting a panel of outstanding researchers for a live recording of our podcast on Sunday, October 27th, and we're sponsoring a science trivia challenge at a celebration event that evening. For more details or to register, visit sciencewriters2019.org. We hope to see you there.
Welcome back to the Symbiotic podcast. I'm Cole Hans. This is a production of the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences. And we're going to wrap up our conversation today with Andrew Reed, Nina Jablonski, and Cristina Rosa by taking a look at Penn State, where we all work. Penn State University has developed into a hotbed for this kind of work, the transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, however you want to term it. We're getting pretty good at Penn State, not to toot our horn too much, but now we're trying to figure out why that is, and let's talk about how we can extend that out into the world and do some good with it. So I'm going to start off by asking Nina to chime in. We've spoken in the past about what it is about this particular place where we are here at Penn State that kind of caused us to almost accidentally, I think, get good at this stuff. Could you tell us your perspective?
Penn State has benefited greatly from having some very prescient administrators back in the mid-20th century. They recognized that here we are in the middle of Pennsylvania, and we've got a bunch of interesting colleges and a bunch of interesting departments in those colleges. And wow, there are some overlapping interests. How are we going to make this work? How are we going to make sure that facilities don't get duplicated? Oh, let's make centers that might bring together people with common interests. Fast forward into the later 20th century, let's not only make centers that bring together people from diverse places that have common interests, but let's make institutes like the Huck Institutes of the Life Sciences that bring together groups of centers and then more individuals who have common interests in life science research from every possible angle. Now, the beautiful thing about this institute structure that was created is that it was meant to be cross, multi, inter, and transdisciplinary by design. It was meant to demolish or at least reduce the effect of these silos in which administrative departments exist. And for the most part, it has worked, and it's worked for decades now. So when I say that Penn State is sort of pre-adapted to transdisciplinary work, this is why, because we've been doing it for a long time, initially because of financial necessity, but now this is the way science is working. This is the way much of knowledge building is working. So we're in a great shape.
And how much do you think did that have to do with being kind of in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of central PA?
That certainly helped.
Urban areas. That's another piece of the puzzle I think we've discussed, is that if we were in a more urban area, we'd have other kind of big institutions to collaborate with outside of Penn State, and it's almost like we had to look inward and do that within our own university to some degree, yes?
Plus, there's a scale issue. We are a very large institution. So 50,000 students on this campus, another 50,000 or so in the Penn State system as a whole. That's a lot of faculty involved in the teaching. So a lot of expertise around the place. So the scale really helps. If you think about some of the smaller institutions around the US, the Princetons or the Rockefellers, they can specialize in their areas of excellence as they do. They can't bring to bear this very, very transdisciplinary approach that we can.
That's right.
And I think the third element is proximity. We are all forced to stay in very, very close proximity. The campus has been designed to be a central campus and not to expand too much. And we are in a small community where we meet our fellow scientists every day outside in town. So we are forced to talk to each other.
Yeah, I've heard that you better be nice. You can't get away with being too grumpy or too much of a pain around here because there's nowhere to hide and nowhere to get around, right?
Yeah, and symbiosis cannot occur if you don't meet each other.
That's right. That's right. Absolutely. I would like to ask each of you a little bit about how this transdisciplinary work has benefited you personally at Penn State with some of your own research, if you don't mind.
Maybe I can start since I'm the youngest in terms of career here. And for my career, it was very important to come to a community that is very welcoming and very open. And I found this incredible after being at other universities. So for me, I was able to interact with people and collaborate on plant sciences, entomology, biology, but also engineering and physicists. For me, this has been crucial to set up my new lab and to go ahead with my research.
Ever since I arrived here almost 13 years ago, I've been interacting and collaborating with people from the Eberly College of Science, the College of Agriculture, the College of Education, and within my own College of the Liberal Arts, and actually Health and Human Development. And the fact that you can pick up the phone or drop somebody an email and they'll say, oh, yeah, I'd like to talk to you. It would be great. The fact that there is this immediate interest. Now, some people are busier than others, and we understand that, but there is this immediate sort of, I want to hear. Let's try this. That ability, that willingness to roll up your sleeves, listen, and try something is fantastic.
Right on.
Yeah, I've been here 12 years now, and in that time, I'm a co-hire between two different colleges, so I go to two different types of faculty meeting, and I meet lots of people that way. I'd say the intellectual input I've had from the agriculture sector has been actually amazing. Made me look at a lot of the biology I do in a very different way. My research itself has benefited most from working with mathematicians, although one of the most striking, and I've also got a project running at the moment with communication scientists, social scientists who work on health messaging, which is really stretching my intellectual ability. The biggest accidental collaboration I have had was one of the chemistry professors had heard somebody give a talk about resistance and said, you must meet Andrew. And so this guy, an engineer, and I decided that we would have lunch together. And it transpired within the first couple of minutes that we were using the word resistance in a different way.
Right.
And we thought we were now stuck with a lunch with nothing else in common for an hour. But it turned out that the mathematics that he used to study, it turned out to be cell phone batteries. The mathematics he used to deal with cell phone batteries was the same mathematics that we used to figure out how to treat patients with infections and cancer. Wow. Now, who knew that the underlying math would be the same? And we now have a collaboration going with the engineers who are figuring out how well we need to measure what in stuff that we thought we were doing uniquely for many years. And that was completely accidental and is one of these things, because of the scale of the place, you can bump into an engineer who works on cell phones and discover commonalities.
That's beautiful. We're talking about evolution. We're talking about the evolution of science. And we're talking about accidents versus being conscious, right? So I'm going to send a challenge back to you, Andrew, as the new director of the Huck Institute, where we have people working at all these different scales, right? We've got people down to nanotechnology, the nanoscale, the tiniest we can even conceive of, all the way up to macro global biomes of huge areas of terrain around the earth and diseases moving across the earth. how do you think we can stitch together all of those pieces in a bigger way to take on some of these challenges, all the way from the micro to the macro?
Well, first, let me just say that you've got the scale wrong. We go from angstroms through to the galaxy.
Oh,
People in astrobiology.
Okay, yeah, it's even bigger than
People in astrobiology have been in touch. So don't think of the Earth as a limitation here.
Didn't mean to diss you like that.
Yeah, I think there are several ways we can do it, but the most obvious way to me is to focus around a particular problem. And at the moment, I can see several medical ones that we could think of. I mentioned autism before, and that's an example where there are elements to that issue which flow from the genes, how the molecules are interacting that those genes produce, and that's down to potentially the angstrom level that you're talking about, right up to the social structures in which we raise and support and help people at various different degrees of autism difficulty, but also the positives that go with those states as well. That's an issue that runs from the angstroms right through to population health and population stresses. Another one of those is nutritional issues and obesity. Sure, we know what we should eat. Actually, sometimes we don't. There's still ongoing debate about quite a bit of what we should eat. Yeah. Some of the answers to that are molecular at the angstrom level. Mm-hmm. And then behavior change is often a societal issue. And it goes right up to the question of overall population health and what's available, flows of food around the planet, waste systems, all of those issues. That's the full scale. So I think if we can, as Penn State, find ourselves issues around which many people at these different, working on these with expertise on these different scales, will work complementarily on these problems, then that will allow us to make full use of the scale and interdisciplinary culture that we have. I completely agree with Nina that we've had this baked into our culture, our intellectual environment for many years, and there's lots more we can do with that, which will really be fantastic in the years to come.
Sounds great. Terrific. Does anybody else want to chime in on scale? We're going to ask one last question beyond that. My final question to everybody is, where do you think this is headed from here? What do you see as maybe a next step or somewhere to aim to kind of advance and consciously evolve the way that transdisciplinary research is done? What's it going to take?
Well, one of the things that really impresses me is that the highest levels of the Penn State administration recognize that this is important. It isn't just down at the level of the faculty members. The president, the provost see this as the future, and they're trying to make it happen. Now, they have their own difficulties and logistical things that they have to overcome, but they recognize that this is the way that knowledge is going to increase. This is how the university is going to thrive. And so I think that is something that is enormously important for us to recognize, that we have the sort of the wind in our sails pushing us forward, not blowing in our faces. There'll still be a lot of work for us to do, but the fact that we have the highest level of the administration recognizing this issue is critical.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think this is our legacy as Penn State. I think proceeding in this direction is what we have to do, and what we are going to train our students and ourselves to do for the future.
Right
on. I think in terms of next steps, there are lots of things that we've tried in the past that have worked well. We need to learn from those, and then try a whole lot of new things. And I think there's a lot to work on about optimal sizes of groups, how you get the complementary skills together in the same room, what works in terms of personalities. We can try a lot of that. Money is a part of it, but it's not a huge part of it. A little bit of money is often needed to stand something up, get people's attention. But I would say it's a question of finding the right problems around which people congeal.
Yeah.
The right problems. Going to the moon, that's a problem that was well defined, and you start with low Earth orbit and then you go from there. And it's a great problem, and it was posed as a really good challenge by Kennedy. Yeah. And it got all those very, very thousands of people working together on one thing at all sorts of scales. Amazing. And I think there's a lot of scope for trying to find ourselves some problems that we can own that are like that get lots of people around. And it might turn out we start with 4 or 5 people to start with, but the problem is big enough, it'll soon bring lots of groups in.
Well, let's hope we find the right problems to marshal all those forces and put them all on the same trajectory, working together in a symbiotic fashion where everybody learns from everybody else and then the world benefits as a result. That's what we're here to do, right?
Absolutely.
Indeed. And it'll be fun.
Absolutely. And that's important too. Let's not forget to make it fun. Well, thank you all so much for being a part of this first conversation. In future episodes, we'll be digging in on specific research projects and the challenges and tribulations and what people learn and how they grow and how we advance science in this way. But I just want to thank you again for being a part of getting it all started. So cheers. Thanks again so much.
Cheers. Thank you.
And
Here's to the
Thank you.
Good luck with the series.
Thanks.
Indeed.
Thank you very much.